Let's talk highlights and lowlights from this weekend of the Preakness on this episode of the Win Place Show. Salutations and welcome, friends. I'm your host to this episode of the Win Place Show. My name is Matthew DeSantis, and you can find me on Twitter at the handle at Failed to Menace. Well, thank you so much for everybody who has been tuning in and subscribing to Trust the Profits. Make sure to press that subscribe button to get all of our continuing content. Even though we might not have a Triple Crown winner this year, we still have a ton of content leading up to the Belmont, well beyond, getting ready for Saratoga, getting ready for the fall meets, getting ready for Breeders' Cup, going overseas, looking what's going on in Japan, looking what's going on in Europe. A lot of great race coverage that we have. And oh, by the way, live betting Thursday nights on the Cocktail Lounge, maybe some live betting Monday nights, Assiniboia. That might be heating up pretty shortly. Always a fun track to talk about in Canada. So we got a lot of things going on here at Trust the Profits. And on top of our horse racing news, handicapping shows, everything else that we're doing here, we got you covered. So press that subscribe button. Also, make sure to like this video, comment below with what was your biggest takeaway from the weekend. And listen, there were positive takeaways. There were negative takeaways. No doubt about it. We're going to talk about all of those as we dive into this episode of the Win Play Show. And I should also say a special thank you to my guest last week on Capping the Card, Ashley Mayu. Ashley and I had a very good day on Preakness Day with Capping the Card. We managed to give out 12 of the 14 winners on the Preakness Day card, 9 for Ashley, 7 for myself between our top picks and value plays. So we had very good days. I hope you all had very good days betting at the track and had some profitable bets come back. But let's dive into the headline of the weekend, which is, of course, the Preakness Stakes. So let's talk about the Preakness in all of its glory, in all of its issues that it had, and the cloud that, kind of hung over the Preakness as well because of what took place earlier in the day at Pimlico. Well, let's focus on the race first, and then we'll talk about some of the other things momentarily. But the race itself played out exactly the way I said it was going to. If you listen to me and not El Hombre, listen, El Hombre loves him some Mage. And I don't know. I've not talked to El Hombre since the race is over. We might need to do a wellness check on him. I hope he's doing okay because he was all in on Mage. I was never all in on Mage. I was always kind of banging the drum for National Treasure. A lot of you in the comments said I was crazy. Well, apparently I'm crazy like a fox because we cashed that ticket with National Treasure winning the 148th Preakness Stakes. And the reason I like National Treasure had less to do with the horses, to be honest, and it had more to do with the pace dynamics. But that changed dramatically in the days leading up to the Preakness with the announcement that First Mission, Brad Cox's colt, who was the second choice in the morning line, was going to scratch due to a left hind leg issue and an injury. It was a veterinary scratch. Therefore, First Mission not allowed to run. Once that happened, man, I felt even better about National Treasure winning this race because there was going to be no pressure on National Treasure out on the front end. And guess what? We saw an incredibly pedestrian front end fraction for National Treasure. 24 and change opening quarter, 48 and change, 48 and 4, almost a 49-second opening half. Very slow. Gave National Treasure plenty of opportunity to save something, to then withstand the late driving charge from Blazing Sevens, who really pushed him there at the very end. And National Treasure able to kind of get back out in front and, like I said, withstand that charge from Blazing Sevens to win the Preakness Stakes, gate to wire fashion. And that was kind of what I had foreseen the whole time, was nobody was going to put pressure on National Treasure. Coffee with Chris is a nice horse, but he's not the sort of horse that's going to put pressure on a horse the caliber of National Treasure. Blazing Sevens made a great run with Irad. I thought that was a really smart ride that he gave. Made sure Blazing Sevens was a lot closer than he normally is. It was a wide trip, no doubt about it. But then he really came on strong. Now, I was watching the race. I had to chuckle. I was watching the race with someone who rides horses regularly, not for racing, but just rides horses a lot. But they don't watch racing very often. And they said to me, why is that number 7 horse continuing to come over and bump the number 1 horse? And why is this number 7 horse continuing to come over and make things? I go, oh, well, that's Irad Ortiz Jr. You just must not be familiar with Irad, but that's what he does. And indeed, Irad can't help himself. Blazing Sevens goes over like 5 paths to, make things tight for National Treasure, and, bumps away. And somebody, took some photos and some screenshots. And listen, the screenshots would tell you the story of Irad in that race looked a lot like Sonny Leone in the Lucas Classic, and Sonny got a 15-day suspension for that. Is Irad going to get a 15-day suspension? Probably not. He'll get a pat on the back and second place prize money. But, that's the thing. Nobody punishes Irad. I mean, New York does a little bit, but nobody else really does. And even New York, I would argue, is more of a slap on the wrist than anything else. So, he's going to keep riding like that unless anybody tells him to stop doing it. And I know there's some people who think, hey, that's just riding, that's just aggressive, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I didn't think there was anything disqualifying about that. Let me be clear. But it's one of those things where I'm like, God, you just can't run in a straight line, can you? You just can't help yourself. You have to come over all the time. And that's just what Irad does. And you just kind of have to know it. And Johnny Velasquez is a veteran. He knows what Irad's doing, and he was able to withstand it. And certainly National Treasure was able to withstand that charge. Listen, Mage finishes third. Obviously, everybody was hoping for the Triple Crown opportunities going to the Belmont. One of the very first things I said after the Kentucky Derby, though, if you watched any of our coverage, I said it's possible he bounces off that Kentucky Derby effort. This is still a young horse. There's a reason Mage was 15-1 in the Kentucky Derby. Okay? There's a reason. Just because he won doesn't mean there wasn't a reason he was 15-1. There was a reason. It's because he was a lightly raced horse who'd only ever won his maiden special weight race. That's it. Okay? Now, if we're going to give Rich Strike a hard time about basically doing the same thing, winning a maiden claimer and then winning the Kentucky Derby, guess what, folks? We got Rich Strike Part 2 in that regard. We got a horse that won his maiden special weight and hasn't won the Kentucky Derby. Now, I think Mage has the opportunity to win a lot more races if they continue to run him, but we got to wait and see. I think he's a good horse, but he's still a young horse, and young horses have ups and downs. That's just natural for their progression. It's not linear, okay? It's not this, all right? It just doesn't keep going up. There's going to be hills, there's going to be peaks, there's going to be valleys. That's just the nature of horse racing. He got slow pace to run behind, and at the end of the day, when he was asked for a little bit more at the end, Javi, asked him and just didn't have it. Now, you could say it was a 2-week turnaround. The fact that all these other horses were fresh, they didn't have to run the Kentucky Derby. Yeah, potentially so. That goes back to some of the discussions we had about whether or not the Kentucky Derby, Preakness, Belmont, Triple Crown schedule needs to be changed or edited in some way. I don't think giving more time is going to change too much, but I do understand the frustrations sometimes of new horses coming in and being fresh and being able to run these big races like National Treasure and Blazing Sevens did, as opposed to a horse that just went through a really grueling race 2 weeks previously. Ultimately, though, it was all about National Treasure. Now, here gets the complicated part. And because, listen, I've always loved National Treasure. I like him as a horse. I've made no bones about that. I like the horse, National Treasure, a lot. I love his pedigree. I liked his running style. I knew that the longer he went, the better he would be. And I love the addition of blinkers as well, making him focus a little bit more, getting him out on the front end, not having to worry about passing horses. So love the horse. Thrilled that my bets cashed that day. But at the end of the day, that is still a horse that is trained by Bob Baffert. And there's nobody in the industry who attracts more attention, good and bad, than Bob Baffert. And obviously that took place on Preakness Day as well. We saw several races earlier, one of his top sprinters having a meltdown, having to be euthanized on the track after a catastrophic breakdown during a stakes race, coming out, and very sad moment, obviously, for the horse. And you hate to see that. Luis Saez, of course, also looked like he was, obviously in very bad shape, although Louis recovered very quickly and was off to Churchill Downs to ride on Sunday. So Luis Saez, okay. The horse obviously suffered a catastrophic front left leg injury, and it was deemed inoperable and had to be euthanized right there on the track. Very sad moment. Very sad moment. I listen, people, if you ever zoom in on my YouTube, I have a photo of Barbaro over my shoulder in my background. I don't have that photo of Barbaro just because of how great he was in the Kentucky Derby. Okay. And he was brilliant. And I watched that Kentucky Derby, 2000. I watched that over and over and over again. I keep that there to remind me of the fragility of the sport. and the fragility of these animals and the danger that exists in horse racing, because Barbaro is a heartbreaking story of lost talent, and just these things happen with these animals, and it's incredibly sad to see. That's first and foremost. Okay, I've been around horses enough to know that a horse can just be out in the field playing by themselves and take a misstep. You got to put them down. I have a friend who had that happen. Their horse was just out in a field, galloping around, having fun, just doing that, and just took a misstep. It's awful. It is awful, and it is a thing to grieve and to mourn. But it is the nature of the sport. It is the nature of horses in some ways. Now, horse racing can exacerbate these things. And certainly the rash of horse deaths that we have seen over the last 3 weeks, between everything leading up to the Kentucky Derby at Churchill, and even several deaths after that at Belmont, at Churchill Downs as well, and now having a meltdown at Pimlico, in addition to, oh, by the way, the horse deaths that took place at Laurel about a month or so ago that led to the shutdown of that track in Maryland for a week or two, while people looked at the soundness of that surface and that home stretch in particular. Listen, this is a problem. This is a really big problem. And I know people are going to say, Matthew, this was Bob Baffert and having a meltdown, one of his horses. Then he comes back to win the Preakness. This is just a bad look. I don't disagree with any of you. I don't disagree with you on that. It's not a good look. It's not a good look that the trainer whose horse had to be euthanized earlier in the day comes back to win the Preakness with another horse. And then in the post-race interview, doesn't even mention the horse's name that was euthanized. Listen, if I was a PR person, I would have told Bob, listen, you got to say some things here. I understand him maybe being in his emotions, and you could tell, very emotional in the moment. And it was, one of those things where, how does that look for the sport? How does that look for the general public? The general public doesn't understand these things. The general public doesn't understand why a horse hurts his leg and has to be put down, because they don't understand horses. They just see this happen on big day. And they see a trainer who's been accused and has been suspended because of overages, because of medical overages, repeated medical overages in the case of Bob Baffert. And they go, well, that horse must have been doped up. Now, we don't know if having a meltdown had any illicit medication in the system at all. And listen, if it comes out later on with a necropsy that there was, pain masking medication, something along those lines, that he was being given above and beyond legal limits, then that is a discussion for that day. We can't sit here and speculate on that right now. What I do know, though, and this is a concerning part, and we're going to get to more race recaps, so I don't want you to think we're just going to go off on some diatribe here for 10 minutes. But one of the concerns that we have is that as this sport gets more and more negative scrutiny, and as this sport gets scrutiny both from government officials and from gamblers, because listen, if you're a bettor, horse racing is one of the least reliable sports to bet on. Just is. It's an incredibly unreliable sport to bet on if you are a gambler. And I don't care how smart you think you are. You could be the smartest guy in the room and you can handicap till kingdom come. But how many times have you heard or know that a trainer says, well, we're not really trying to win this race, right? This is a tune-up for the next race. If you're average Joe Schmo, how do you know what trainer A intends for his horse or her horse on that particular day? Is this just a leg stretcher? Is this actually a legitimate chance to try to win? What do we try to do here? What are we trying to achieve in these races? Okay. I mean, that alone is a variable that you don't have to worry about in other sports. All right. Now, maybe a midweek, mid-season NBA game, maybe not everybody's trying at 110%, but nobody's throwing the game. Nobody's going out there beforehand and going, we're not even going to really try to win. Now, sometimes you can look at the rosters and people are sitting and things like that. You go, okay, this is probably the outcome that's going to happen. Sure. But at least you know those variables ahead of time before tip-off. There's going to be more scrutiny from gamblers. There's going to be more scrutiny from government officials. I say this as someone who has multiple degrees in political science. I say this as someone who taught political science and still does teach political science for the better part of 15 years. I don't say that to throw bona fides in your face. I say that to make it clear that I'm not just some blowhard that's, talking off the cuff. What I am telling you is that when government officials get involved, things are going to go downhill. And they're going to go downhill in a variety of different ways. On one hand, the federal government has an incredible capacity to do things when it wants to. Okay. The problem is that the federal government does not understand the problem. And very few government entities understand the problem. You have to understand your elected officials are very smart people, but they're not necessarily smart at politics and they're not smart at everything they're passing laws about. They're very talented individuals who are lawyers and doctors and real estate agents and business people in their own personal private lives. And then they, started to get involved in local elections. And next thing you know, they find themselves in Congress. They don't understand the issues that they're legislating. All you have to do is go back and watch Representative or Senator Ted Stevens, former senator from Alaska, refer to the internet as a series of tubes. He was somebody responsible for regulating the internet. That's not exactly what you want to see. This is the concern with horse racing as well. When you get this level of scrutiny, suddenly people who don't know what they're talking about start piping up and talking about regulating a sport, passing laws about a sport that it doesn't understand. That doesn't mean that it's not coming from a well-intended place. That doesn't mean that there may not be good things that come out of it. It's something to concern yourself with, though. That is the problem that we have, is that people who are in positions of power see these types of days, see these types of events, and want to take action, but they don't understand the underlying issues in the sport, and they are going to take a sledgehammer when a more precision-based object would be better. But that's the concern we have in horse racing. And we cannot continue to sit here and plug our ears and stick our head in the sand and act as if there's not a problem. We have to be more proactive as a sport. We have to show that we are legislating ourselves effectively. Hence HISA, okay? Hence all of these other regulatory efforts. We need to show the government, we need to show elected officials, we need to show the general public that we are a sport you can trust. And weekends like the one we just had do not go very far in doing that, okay? We need to be better about this. And that is the cloud that was hanging over the 148th Preakness. And that is extremely unfortunate. But we should not forget having a meltdown as a horse. I know I talked to several people. I know I did as well. Gave to different thoroughbred aftercare charities after hearing of the news of having a meltdown, being euthanized, and giving in certainly his honor. Terrible news. Just terrible news all the way around. We don't like to see that. Listen, that's the Preakness. That's what we're going to keep talking about, these types of issues, because they're not comfortable topics to have. Okay. They're not comfortable conversations to have. I got a text message from my dad 2 hours before I recorded this. My father's a lifelong horse racing fan, went to law school at Pepperdine University, went to Santa Anita, Del Mar, Hollywood Park, Los Alamitos. He went to all those tracks back in the 70s. He loves horse racing, loves it. He sent me a giant text, all caps, because he's my dad. Horse racing is in jeopardy! ! That's the message, folks. When my dad's telling you that, that's a problem. Because if my dad thinks horse racing is in jeopardy, holy hell, what does the rest of the public think? This is a guy who loves the sport, and he thinks it's in jeopardy. This is where we are. This is where we are, though. And weekends like the one we just had, it doesn't move us in the right direction. I'll say that. Now, let's talk about some of the other races, because that's what we do here on the Win Play Show. We talk about everything from horse racing news to handicapping to recapping of the races. So let's talk about some of those other races. Let's talk about Black Eyed Susan Day a little bit. And obviously a huge effort there from Taxed in the Black Eyed Susan. Just a huge, huge effort. And listen, this was another instance, and this is something I talked about a lot. You get those horses out of the slop at Oaklawn Park, and you never know how they're going to be able to run. Defining Purpose did it in the Ashland. Tax did it in the Black Eyed Susan. I tell you, that Oaklawn circuit was strong, but you never know it because they're running through 3 feet of mud the entire winter. And so that form was muddied literally and figuratively the entire time. And suddenly you get these horses on a dry, fast track, and holy hell, Taxed looks a hell of a lot better. And oh my God, look how good Defining Purpose looks. Yeah, it's amazing how much better these horses look when you give them good conditions to run in. But Taxed got the setup. Listen, this was a horse. We talked about it in the fantasy draft. If you watch that, we talked about it on a few other shows. Taxed was a horse we identified as a bad morning line. 15-1. I said, there's no way this horse is 15-1. This is a good horse. I can't take credit. I didn't pick Taxed to win, and she wasn't even my value play. But she was a horse that I absolutely thought would be able to finish in the trifecta or a super at worst. And she got the win. She had a great trip, came charging late. Awesome effort. Another awesome effort. Hoosier Philly. Hoosier Philly put it all together finally a little bit. And this is a horse we've been waiting for to see, and just felt like these first two efforts at the fairgrounds were so poor, coming out of really a dominant 2-year-old year. Gets on the front end and really, I mean, we'll talk about a gutty effort to finish second. Great effort there from Hoosier Philly, withstanding several challenges. Taxed ultimately overtakes her. And what a great story Taxed is, by the way. All the things we just talked about are absolutely true. But then you'll see a story like Taxed, and my gosh, you can't ask for a better story. Randy Morse claiming this horse for $50,000, and then this horse ends up going out and winning the Grade 2 Black-Eyed Susan. That's a great story for the sport. There are great stories out there, and that was one of them. Hoosier Philly, like I said, tons of fans out there. Got bet down from 10-1 morning line down to about 5-1 by post time. And like I said, put out a great effort. Bob Baffert's horse from the West Coast, Feza, set kind of a wide trip, I thought, most of the way around, and just didn't seem to have the most comfortable trip, even though she was in the clear, but just always seemed to be wide at every turn. Ended up finishing third in that race. Not a bad effort, but maybe not a great effort either. But listen, credit to Taxed, credit to Randy Morris, credit to our own Jessica Tugwell on this channel, who absolutely loved Taxed and was touting that horse leading up to the Black-Eyed Susan. And I know for a fact that Jessica cashed on a few tickets of Taxed, so she put her money where her mouth was on that one and got the win there with Taxed in the Black-Eyed Susan. Now, a couple of other performances that we saw over the weekend, two fantastic sprinting performances this weekend, one on Friday, one on Saturday. Maple Leaf Mel on Friday. Oh, my word. That horse, listen, I'll be the first one to admit that was a horse I was selling on. I did not think that horse was good enough. It was coming out of those state restricted stakes races up in New York, and I just didn't know how good Maple Leaf Mel really was against open company. Well, he answered all those questions pretty damn quickly. He was able to open up lengths on that field, front running effort, so impressive. Once asked, just started opening up with ease on the rest of that field. Just dominant sprinting performance on Friday. And then, not to be outdone, on Saturday, one of the wow moments of the weekend, in my opinion, was Dan Blacker's Straight No Chaser, just dominating stakes competition, sprinting. They were going fast up front, 22 and 44. And then when they hit the stretch, Straight No Chaser had some afterburners on and just opened up as if the rest of them were running in quicksand. I mean, that was an incredibly impressive effort from both Straight No Chaser and Maple Leaf Mel. Friday and Saturday, two of the wow performances, in my opinion, that I saw over the weekend. And one of the other wow performances I saw was a horse I absolutely love, which is Nagarok in the James W. Murphy for Graham Motion. And that was another beautiful ride by Flavian Pratt. An absolutely beautiful ride. Breaking from the number 9 post and being able to get over onto the rail going into the first turn, sitting second flight, saving all the ground, being able to sit behind some pretty fast fractions and sitting close to those fractions, but sitting behind those fast fractions, and then angling out around the third and fourth turn, coming for home, and just, again, put the afterburners on and won with ease and just pulled away and just no problem at all. And that was something else. That was a really special effort from Nagarok, a horse that I've been a big fan of for a while, a horse that I used at 39-1 underneath at the Breeders' Cup and cashed some trifectas that day because of Nagarok. And so I've always been a little partial to that horse. You know that I was a big fan of Graham Motion as a horse person, and great effort there from Nagarok there in the James W. Murphy. Listen, there's also some other news taking place from all over the world as it relates to horse racing. So let's go over to Japan because there were some huge races over there. The Japanese Oaks and Liberty Island. If you want to watch the best performance of this past weekend, you might have to just dial that one up on YouTube. Just type in Liberty Island, Japanese Oaks, and my gosh, what a filly. As we celebrate the fillies and the Black Eyed Susan, and we saw some great ones a couple weeks ago in the Kentucky Oaks, my gosh, she just opened up at will, won by 7 lengths on the turf, might very well be the best 3-year-old filly in the world right now. And again, in Japan, this is the trend, folks. This is where it's going. I know that Derma finished 6th. I know that Mandarin Hero finished 12th in the Kentucky Derby. That doesn't change the tide of where things are going. And where things are going is there's a lot more dominant horses over in Japan than we realize. And a horse like Liberty Island is a perfect example of that. Might very well be the best talented 3-year-old filly. I'm excited that the Breeders' Cup is in the West Coast this year at Santa Anita. I'm hoping we get to see a large contingent of these Japanese horses come over this year and compete in the Breeders' Cup, because I think that would be really special. And it would be another opportunity for American audience to see horses beyond just Derma Sotogake and Mandarin Hero and a few others. I want them to be able to see the whole fleet of Japanese horses. Great effort over there. There was also some craziness taking place over in Newberry on the other side of the other kind of side of the world, quite frankly, on the other side of the Atlantic from us, with Modern Games. That's right. Everybody's favorite horse that runs for purse money only from his juvenile Breeders' Cup turf victory. Modern Games and William Buick actually got the worst of being savaged by Chindit. Chindit was a 22-1 long shot who was up in the front of the Lockheed Stakes at Newberry, and Modern Games goes flying by him, and Chindit did not take kindly to that and went after Buick and went after Buick's hand in particular, and had a hold of it. And it was a scary moment where it really looked like William Buick was going to potentially lose a hand for a moment. And we can laugh about it now because everybody's fine, but it was a scary moment there for a second. Reminds you of, obviously, people think most recently of Firenze Fire and Yalpin going after, Firenze Fire going after Yalpin up at Saratoga a couple of years ago. And it was very certainly reminiscent of that, but another kind of crazy race that we saw there for Modern Games, who always seems to have some crazy races happening to him wherever he might run. Listen, let's talk a little bit more about what we can expect moving forward, though. First of all, some other news that we have. One, Forte is back on the work tab. So your Kentucky Derby morning line favorite, who is scratched for veterinary reasons, is back on the workout tab. There is speculation that he is going to be going to the Belmont. I've never viewed Forte as a Belmont horse, but he's going to be very, very fresh. I will say that. Tapit Trice also likely headed there. Who else is headed there? Mage is not going to be headed there. We know that already. The connections have said no. Will National Treasure go? We don't know. Will Blazing Sevens go? That feels maybe a little bit more likely, but I still would not put a lot of money on that. I don't think Chad Brown's going to run that horse back in 3 weeks at the Belmont. Are we going to see a horse like Archangelo? Are we going to see a horse like Bishop's Bay? Are we going to see First Mission potentially come back and be ready in 3 weeks' time for Brad Cox? Those are questions that we still don't have the answers to. And the question is, what does that Belmont's race really look like as a result of that? 2 Phils, who finished second in the Kentucky Derby, unlikely to run at the Belmont. His trainer, Larry Ravelli, had said he's likely headed to either the Grade 3 Matt Winn at Churchill Downs or going to go to the Ohio Derby. So he's not going to go there. I would imagine we might see him later this summer up at Saratoga, Jim Dandy and the Travers, races like that, but he's not going to jump right back into the Triple Crown race at this point either. So going to be interesting to see what we see out of these horses moving forward and where they might be headed over the next couple of weeks. Obviously, there's a slew of Bob Baffert horses that we don't have updates on. A horse like Faustin, a horse like Cave Rock, a horse like Gandolfini. I don't know where those horses are. They're not on the work tab. Presumably they're around. I don't know if they're active anymore or not, or if they're going to get retired. I mean, obviously, everything that we saw last year, with Cave Rock, with its juvenile record, and then not, having been seen really since November, except for a couple of workouts in April. Don't know what's been, don't know if something went wrong with that horse, what have you. So a lot of things to be paying attention to there. Okay. And listen, like I said, I don't mean to be a downer about kind of where we are as a sport right now, but it's a concern. Everything that happened this weekend has been a legitimate issue, and it's something we have to do better at as a sport. And we have to hold people accountable. We have to ask for more transparency. We have to ask for more rapid transparency. And we have to know the right people to ask about these things. I see some people going, oh, Naira has been hiding Todd Pletcher's thing. Well, that's not Naira. That's the New York Gaming Commission. That's a separate entity. Now, we can put pressure on them. I agree. We should. But know who is at fault for these types of things. Okay. And going after the right sort of people and holding those people accountable. Again, I know Heise is far from perfect, but this is where we're at least moving and trying to have some oversight into the sport that we all love so much, but seems to always be shooting itself in the foot on its biggest days. And it just can't get out of its own way. And obviously, we have casualties like having a meltdown take place. And that is a casualty for the sport, but a casualty, obviously, for the connections in the horse. And so like I said, devastating, absolutely devastating. I missed that race live, and I have not been able to bring myself to find a replay to watch of that. I don't want to see it, and I just don't have the stomach to see it. I've seen plenty of breakdowns. I know what it looks like. I'm not trying to hide from that, but I just, maybe later this week I'll finally get a chance to look at it and maybe be in, want to look at it. I don't know if that's even the right word, but if I feel the need to look at it, I certainly will. I don't want to hide from the kind of dark corners of the sport and the dark aspects of the sport, but it's difficult sometimes for sure. But I also want to finish up on a positive note. Okay. And I know that's abrupt, transition, but I do want to end on a positive note. And that is, I want to give a shout out to one of my favorite trainers and favorite people, Carrie Bryan, who trains a horse, Caroline Christina, who won on Kentucky Black-Eyed Susan Day. And she's a first-time runner, and she broke her maiden over the turf sprinting. And she was my top pick. So I was very, very happy about this. Almost a $16 winner is my top pick. So I was very happy with that part of it. But I also just root for Carrie. Carrie's a tremendous trainer. A lot of you who have played any steeplechase contests on Stable Duel, you probably know Carrie's horses really well there. But she obviously also trains flat running as well. And Caroline Christina, huge effort there. Listen, her dam, this is actually quite impressive. Her dam and actually now is 2 for 2 with first time out starters. Both of them ran huge races sprinting on the turf. So next time you see that dam pop up, next time you see a half brother or half sister to Caroline Christina, maybe you want to place a little bit of a wager that first time out for that horse. But couldn't be happier for Carrie, obviously on a big Mid-Atlantic day at Black-Eyed Susan Day. Brittany Russell, obviously also a ton of success on Black-Eyed Susan Day and on Preakness Day as well. We're happy for both of them. Always love to see those Mid-Atlantic trainers show out and do well on big days where there's a lot of national attention. So happy for both Carrie, happy for Brittany. And certainly there's a lot of positives to take out of what took place over the weekend. There were a lot of great stories, great efforts. Okay. But there's also a lot of clouds hanging over the sport still. And we're not going to shy away from it here on the Win Play Show. We're going to talk about the good. We're going to talk about the bad and everything else in between. All right, folks. Well, listen, that's going to do it for me this week. Until next time, my name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and profitable day at the races and reminding you that it's now post time.